Hi, my name is Julie Ha. I graduated in 2002, and I'm in the for-profit education sector. And last year I purchased a small school, which I changed its name to Mayfield College. And our primary focus actually is in real estate. And so we're in the process of purchasing our first commercial building.
Hi, my name is Rich Kelly, and I am a principal along with my partner Dave Carver of a small private equity firm called Search Fund Partners. We invest exclusively in searchers and their acquisitions afterwards. I graduated here in 1989, and the bulk of my career before that was in commercial real estate and residential real estate development.
Hi, I'm Moises Eilenberg. I was classmates with Julie, class of '02, and my background is primarily in private equity investing. Decided to raise a search fund and try to acquire a company. I closed a deal approximately a year ago to buy a company that manages receivables for healthcare providers. Rich is one of my investors, and I'm just very happy to be here.
I'm Michael Sanabria. I did not do a search fund. About 4.5 years ago, I went out and did my own search, acquired a company. It is a commercial printing company, which for those of you, we're not a walk-up business, but we do manufacturing of things such as wine labels, sales and marketing material that supports brands like Visa, Fetzer, Behringer, so shelf talkers and neckers, things like that you might see in your stores. We print things like that.
And Michael was a classmate of mine here at the GSB in 93.
Class of 93, yes.
I spend a fair amount of my time talking about search funds, which some people kind of find humorous because my husband actually did a search fund. His class of 95. So I've lived them personally, and I certainly live them professionally daily in my job here at the GSB. Moises and Rich, do you want to talk just basically about the search fund process for those who may not be familiar with it?
Sure, I'll start with my perspective. First off, to give you a little bit of context on how deeply we've been drinking the Kool-Aid, we are invested in 9 ongoing companies that were acquired through search funds, and we're currently invested in 8 ongoing searches. So we are thinking, living, and breathing search funds all the time. The gist of a search fund is that people have been buying and selling businesses for thousands of years, and a search fund is a slightly more disciplined way of doing that allows an entrepreneur who envisions themselves running a business and owning it and controlling it a 2-year window, 2.5 year window, where his or her only job is to find the right business for them. Most of the businesses that get bought over time are kind of done on a side job basis, or they're done on a full-time basis but without specific financial backing behind them. Search fund kind of eliminates 2 of those problems by providing financial backing to the entrepreneur and giving them the discipline and focus to be able to say no to the first 100 deals they look at, because they know that they've got quite a bit of time and a fairly discerning investor base that is only going to invest in a deal that really fits the rubric. So we really enjoy the search fund process. We value the 2-year period where the entrepreneur is searching as kind of an option period where we get to know the entrepreneur, work with them, see how they handle disappointment, how they handle negotiations, see how they react to challenges. And so when they finally bring a deal to us, we're usually very comfortable with them as managers, and we're also generally pretty comfortable with the deal, because a deal takes 6 months to close at the fastest, from the first time you contact a seller to the actual closing. So you kind of, instead of a book landing on your desk and having them 3 weeks to decide whether you want to invest in the industry and in the business, you've kind of got a rolling start on it. All of the searchers that we've backed so far have found businesses. That's one of the highest risk points in the in the chain. Evidence sort of shows that up to 40% of the people that do a search fund do not find a business. And all in all, we just think it's a great little specialized asset niche.
What is this you want to talk to from the perspective of
Yeah.
the searcher?
I'll add a couple of things from the searcher perspective. First of all, what the structure allows you to do as an entrepreneur, it allows you to focus on acquiring a company, a much larger company that I think, at least I personally was able to focus on coming right out of business school, and certainly with my own funds, you have a financial backer that allows you to all of a sudden start looking at companies that are, above the $3, $5, $10, maybe even $20 or $25 or $30 million revenues. Whereas if you don't have that backing, it's unless you have a lot of money in the bank, it's very hard to do on your own. And the second thing is, besides the economic equation, it gives you as an entrepreneur the ability to run a business, and sometimes a fairly sizable business, when nobody else, at least in my case, would have given me that opportunity, at least nobody in their right mind. So from that perspective, it's a phenomenal opportunity to get to a level of running a potentially fairly sizable business.
But the general mechanics are, as a search funder, you're raising a fund to fund you to pursue the acquisition. Typically, how many investors do you have?
So the typical structure is you raise a few $100,000 to fund your operating expenses for a period of generally 2 to 3 years. You divide that typically in units between investors that agree to come in and fund your search with the so how many investors? Typically what you do is you have between 5 and 15 investors that come in at the search stage, and there's the understanding that the investor has the opportunity but not the obligation to invest in an acquisition once you create the opportunity. So the two things that the investor in the search stage gets is, number one, the opportunity to invest in an acquisition that you find, and number two, there's typically an economic incentive in the form of what's known as a step up. The money that they put in at the beginning buys them more equity than the investors that come in just at the acquisition stage. So there's an economic incentive to participate in that stage.
I'll also say, for those of you who have not been to our website, the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies website has just a plethora of information about search funds. So if you want old videos, search fund studies, sample acquisition documents, we have everything there. So I encourage you to go there if you want a lot more information. Rich referred to drinking the Kool-Aid. I think here at the GSB that the students and the faculty and staff here think that sometimes the only way to do an acquisition is by way of search fund. But Rich and Michael, do you want to talk to why you decided to not pursue a search fund? I know Julie did it right out of school, and Michael a few years later.
Sure. I did look at the search fund model. In our class, we had several people who had done it.
One's in the next room.
Yeah, exactly. And so I spent a lot of time actually talking to people about the model and what it meant. And what I came down to was that I thought that, one, I was going to target a specific industry. And all the people all my classmates that were doing search funds were doing a more general search. And so I thought targeting a specific industry, I could do it in less time. I was willing to self-fund for a year. I didn't need an income at the time. Or at least my wife was willing to pitch in and support me for a year. And so it wasn't a question of needing income. And since I was targeting a specific industry, while I didn't raise a search fund, I did approach a couple of investors who were in the industry and said, if I bring you the right deal, will you back me? And there was no commitment to that, but I felt that if I brought them the right deal, that they would step up and help me out. So I ended up with 2 investors. The other thing was that my deal was smaller, and you mentioned search fund's given you the ability to go to larger companies. I wanted to own the majority share of my company. I ended up with 55%, and that was important to me. In retrospect, I think it was overly important, and I might do things differently the second time around. But my deal aspirations were smaller, so I didn't need as much financing that a search fund and the access capital they provide that they would provide. So for me, I felt given all those dynamics, I could go out and spend the time and find a company myself.
When I graduated in 2002, I actually found my first company, Florida Career Colleges, about 1 month after graduation, and then marketed that through Prospect Colleges. Subsequently found private equity funding. For Mayfield College, I actually did not raise funds, so I had an opportunity to be the sole investor, which to me is a better fit for what I want to do and what I want to accomplish. So it is a different scenario having private equity in one venture and doing it yourself a second venture. I think it gives you a lot more freedom, but I do think that certainly straight out of business school, it is very hard to buy your own business. But certainly once you get on the merry-go-round, your second, third, or fourth time, you do have that opportunity to be the sole investor. One sort of twist on mine was that I actually purchased a turnaround last year. So typically search funds or even unfunded searches focus on profitable companies. I bought a company that was dying and turned it around. So it gave an opportunity for me to be the sole investor in that.
Were there some elements of the search fund that made it not appealing to you, or it was just doing it on your own was?
Doing it on my own was paramount. I wanted to have 100% equity in the venture. It was very important to me.
Now, Michael, how did you finance your acquisition?
I ended up with my own money, the two investors' money, and then a small business loan, SBA loan. Great.
Certainly, I remember as my husband was going through this and talking to other search funders, it's a tight little group. The fear of coming into purchasing a company and basically you've signed your life up for the next 5 to 7 years. You're getting on a treadmill and you're not getting off. I don't know if that's considerably different than other entrepreneurs who start their own companies, but how do you guys kind of think about that and factor that into your decision to make an acquisition?
For me, it was, I thought about this a lot, and it wasn't something I woke up and did one day. And it sounds like you guys came right out of business school and went into this model. For me, choosing Stanford was in part because of its reputation as having very entrepreneurial students. I knew that I wasn't ready, or at least I didn't have the guts to go do it right out of business school. But every decision after that, the types of jobs I chose, getting into increasingly smaller companies, venture-backed companies, was all about ultimately wanting to be an entrepreneur. So by the time I did it, it wasn't a scary thing. It was like I prepared for a decade to do it.
And you had an industry focus, so it wasn't a random industry you were going into.
No, and I hadn't been in that industry, but I understood the industry. And so by the time I went to my wife and said I want to quit this job making $150 a year and go do a search for a year, she was like, well, that's nice, take your coat, it's cold outside. It was just sort of this, okay, just go ahead and do it. And so it by the time I did it, it wasn't scary. In retrospect, I should have been more scared, but you don't know that until you do it. And so for me, it was being prepared, doing a lot of things professionally, educationally, that by the time I went out and did it, I was confident, I was comfortable, and I just kind of did it.
Well, I'll pitch in. I from my perspective, you talk about making a commitment for 5 to 7 years. The way I looked at it is I was making a commitment to the process, trying to, or the idea of doing something slightly different from the kind of the beaten path, and pursuing the opportunity to run and build a business. That was kind of my central focus, and that was what I was making the commitment to. I was fairly indifferent or I guess didn't really enter too much into my thinking process. Am I committing to an industry that I'm not going to enjoy, or a company that I'm not going to enjoy? I think from an industry perspective, certainly you have the opportunity to focus your search. And from a company perspective, at the end of the day, you're running the company, so you have a lot of power to shape that company. But I think the commitment to the idea is what's really important, to commitment to the concept that you're going to be for a period of maybe 2 to 3 years without knowing what's going to happen next. And to me, that is if I were to give advice to people that are considering doing this, that would be the kind of the key factor that I would consider. Am I comfortable with investing 2 years of my life into this process, which is fairly ambiguous, and you just don't know what's going to happen. It really is a difficult thing to go through. And so to me, it took several months. I started doing a self-funded search, and about 6 to 9 months into it, I decided, yes, this is what I want to do. This is the path I'm going to take, and I just made the decision and ran with it. But certainly with the kind of opportunity cost that we all have coming out of business school, where you might have the opportunity to go into a private equity job or whatnot that may be very economically rewarding. It's a tough decision to make, and you really have to commit to the concept.
Rich, you've seen a number of deals, and we've talked a little bit
Can
about.
I just add a little
ahead.
something to that?
Yeah.
Just a little bit of flavor. Most people here are involved with a business school or some business school or another, and there's a tendency to think that we're in control and that we can manage our lives and manage our careers, and the fact is, and my partner and I, we've found that the people that end up doing a search fund, they've kind of subconsciously or maybe consciously abandoned that notion and realized that they can't help it. They just have to do this. They want to have less control over the planned career path that they have and more control over the day-to-day fabric of what they're doing in their job. They want to have more impact on the business they're working on, and they just have to do it. And if you grind on it too much and think on it too much, chances are it's probably not right for you, because there's just a leap you got to take, and not everybody can do that.
Rich, having seen a number of deals, and we've talked a little bit about the financial structure of search funds, but do you want to talk about the financial structure of the acquisition, what tends to be financed by debt versus equity?
Yes. When we started our fund now 3 years ago, we kind of envisioned that over time, the mix of businesses that we would be invested in would be roughly 70-30 service businesses that are kind of asset light, and manufacturing businesses, which are more traditional LBO candidates. It has not proven out the case. We have virtually no manufacturing businesses. I think that's a function of, one, the obvious macroeconomics going on, and two, there's something about the more dramatic upside possibilities of service industries that seems to attract search funders. As a result of that, the financing structures are a lot more creative. They run the gamut from completely seller financed. So we're involved in a couple of deals where the seller provided 50% of the financing necessary, and equity came in and provided the other half. And the sellers did that knowing that bank financing just wasn't available. There's a couple of deals now. There's 3 or 4 national lenders that are getting pretty comfortable with cash flow lending. There are not a lot of them. Moises' deal is one that has a good cash flow lender. And that's getting closer to the old LBO model, although there's not that much in the way of leverageable assets. And so Moises' deal is pretty highly leveraged. And then we've got a couple of deals that were so attractive, and the banks had dithered around on earlier deals so that our searchers were kind of skitterish about dealing with them, that we just piled in and threw 80% equity at the deal because we wanted to close it so badly. We figured that if we were right and the deal penciled out the way we hoped, we would be able to refinance within a couple of years and then get some leverage. The key is you've got to be pretty nimble and flexible and creative because financing goes the whole spectrum.
Rich, I'm interested in, from your perspective, what your perception is of the benefits for a searcher using a search fund, or doing a search fund as opposed to doing it independently, and what value you and other investors, the Davies is in here too, can add to the search funder as they go through the process.
We work with a couple of teams that are doing a self-funded search. So we're not exclusively married to the search fund per se, but these guys are essentially doing a search fund with their own money. What we shy away from is people that have a day job and then on the side try to find a business, because it really is an all-encompassing search. You have to just look at hundreds of deals, and you have to be able to go down dark alleys time and time again and spend dozens of hours wooing a recalcitrant seller. It's just really time intensive and very emotional, and it's also very lonely, particularly if you're a solo person doing it. So the value that we think we add is one, and this sounds trivial, but we don't think it is picking up the phone by the second ring when they call just looking for somebody to talk to. Because if you're doing a search fund and you're a single searcher, your expenses are low, so you're in some crappy office somewhere in an office park out in South San Francisco, and you're cold calling all day, and you get a lot of rejection, and you kind of get worried that you're going to go down some path that gets off track. So the fact that we're kind of checking in with them all the time, that's helpful.
As I say, as a spouse of a search funder, I appreciated that feature.
Yeah, I mean, no, seriously.
Coming home to me all the time.
Yeah, it's true. The other thing that we add value in, and I think, is providing a network. Now that we've been doing this full-time for 3 years, we've got dozens of people that have either done searches that we're familiar with, or there's our current network of active searchers and active managers. We actually host an annual meeting. They're all talking to each other, swapping tips, swapping leads on investors, swapping leads on banks, swapping leads on recruiting. There's a lot of value to that, and it's building all the time. And then lastly, I think we're helpful in helping guys when they finally, there's always a decision as searchers approach this problem of whether they want to pick an industry and dive down and get to know it a little bit and try to find a business in the industry, or whether they do it opportunistically and look at deals and then learn the industry once they like a deal. We're kind of helpful in guiding them around the industry question, in that we've got experience now with different industries and the earmarks that those industries have, and we may have contacts in industries. And so if somebody starts going down a path, I think it's helpful early on to give them a read on what the investor appetite for that industry may be, because they may think it's real attractive, but they may have a hard time later convincing investors that they're right.
Thank you. For those of you who've searched, either with or without a search fund, do you want to talk a little bit about your process? Did you do industry focused, geography focused? Moises, did you focus on Iowa, or did you just end up there? How you went about the process of actually looking for a company to buy?
Well, I'll start. No, I did not focus on Iowa. In fact, I never even imagined I would end up living in Iowa. When I spoke to the owner of this company, he said where the company was, and I was trying to find on Google Maps where the hell this place was. But so I ended up living in just on the border between Illinois and Iowa, in the heartland, if you will. So my process, like I said before, I started with a self-funded search, which to me it really meant, I wanted to kind of prove to myself before I took other people's money that I could that I felt that I could pull it off. Number one. Number two, I had to go through the process of actually, we were talking about before, making that 5 to 7 year commitment. I really wanted to make sure that I was ready. And I had thought about it for a long time, but that first process really helped me kind of crystallize it and say, yes, this is what I'm going to do, and just kind of plunge in. So in terms of the process, I started with a self-funded search, and I've talked to a lot of search funders or prospective search funders about this, and this is my perspective. This is what worked for me. I know there's people that have done it differently and they have been successful, so this is by no means, I'm by no means pontificating here, but to me, I started doing a fairly focused geographical search focused on Southern California, and I had a relatively, I thought, a good sense of industries that I could be interested in from my time in private equity. And what I concluded at the end of that self-funded search period is that when you go into this, you have to make yourself as efficient as possible, number one, and you have to give yourself the most chances to actually find and buy a good company. And again, the conclusion that I reached is that by focusing on a particular region, and I just wanted to live in Southern California, and I didn't want to live in a place like Iowa, I just came to the conclusion that number one, if you look at opportunities, if you like a couple of industries and you count the number of companies that are in Southern California in that particular industry, and then you take that number and say, okay, how many companies are there across the nation? There's going to be always an order of magnitude difference, and that translates into odds of you being successful. So at the end of the day, I concluded I'm really not giving myself a fair chance if I say I'm going to buy a company in Los Angeles.
Now, Julie and Michael both had industry focuses. Did you have an industry focus, or how did you do your industry analysis to determine what you wanted to be in?
So I started again with a geographic search, fairly opportunistic, and then when I raised my search fund, I said I'm going to go nationwide, and I focused fairly quickly after that on 3 industries. I talked about efficiency, the second piece of the process, and I'll try to be quick here. By focusing on an industry, you can become, in my opinion, a lot more efficient at looking at deals. Because you know an industry, you get an opportunity, you look at it, you already know the industry, you don't have to spend a couple of days figuring out if this is an industry that you want to be in. So you can evaluate a lot more deals a lot more quickly. And you can also kind of get to know some of the key players and start developing relationships and so on and so forth. So I did change my focus to an industry-focused search, and again, those 2 things were, from my standpoint, it just changed the whole game.
Now, once you went to an industry search, how long did it take you to find your company?
Well, so I started, timeline was January. I started my search. I decided I wanted to raise a search fund in September, so that was 9 months into it. I closed the search fund the next April, so that's 7 months after
to raise the search fund.
Yeah,
okay.
And then I actually found the company a few months after I closed the search fund, because I've been searching for that long. So from the time I basically quit my job till the day I closed my deal, 2 years.
Michael, do you want to talk about your process? I suspect you were probably a little more geographically.
I was. It was both industry and geography. For purposes of wanting to be close to family, my wife's family, I was only willing to look from San Jose to the North Bay and East Bay and Peninsula. I wanted to live in Northern California, which having gone through what I've gone through over the last 4 years running this company, it wouldn't have been impossible to do it without my family, but it would have been really difficult. without their support. So I'm glad that I ended up doing that. So I felt that I could do it because of the focus I had. So once I decided the industry I was going after, I needed to go in and refine that, because I initially wanted to go to the more service-based aspect of the industry, but found, as you mentioned, that financing that would have been very difficult. So I ended up going on the manufacturing side and was able to raise, I think it was about 70% of the financing was debt, and which I just never could have done on the service side. Also, there were dynamics on the service side that meant once you bought that company, a lot of your sales could walk out of the door with salespeople, which is much more difficult when you actually control the assets. And so anyway, I needed to go and still refine my search once I decided on the industry. And then after that, it's a lot of blocking and tackling. You've got to buy yourself a headset and get a computer, and you are on the phone and you're dialing for dollars, and you have to create a profile of the type of company. And you talk about this efficiency thing. For me, it was creating that profile, going out, asking the questions, refining the profile, refining the questions, and just getting better at sniffing out the right people and the right deals. As you kind of go on, you got to be willing to iterate, make mistakes, and keep going through it. And then, Julie, you heard this 3 years ago. I mean, what ultimately happened was somebody told me, Jim Ellis, who's here today, I said, tell everyone you know that you're trying to buy a company, and tell your dentist, your doctor, your lawyer, tell everyone, and 'cause you never know where a deal's going to come from. And my mother-in-law sent me a newspaper clipping of a company that was for sale, and so I thought, that's sweet, but I have an MBA, I kind of have a process, a methodology. She doesn't really, So 2 weeks go by, and we're going up to the North Bay to visit my mother-in-law. And I thought, I better call this company because she's going to ask me about it. And darn if it wasn't the company I ended up buying. And so really.
Did you pay a finder's fee?
I didn't, but she was amazing. She wanted her daughter close to home, and she got it.
That was her finder's fee.
And her finder's fee is my 2.5-year-old daughter, who and talking about that family thing. I mean, my wife is in graduate school. She's getting her master's in gerontology, and so. My mother-in-law actually went part-time so that she could take care of my daughter while my wife is commuting down to San Francisco. All those things are just so amazing and such a part of what you end up doing that you can't discount them. So for me, part of my search and part of deciding what I was going to do, the geography thing for me was a lot about family. And like I said, I'm so glad that it worked out that way.
I'm just curious, on the SBA loan that you got, since your company has assets, did you have to sign a personal guarantee, or is it kind of collateralized against the?
Yeah, that's the dirty little secret. I mean, everything I do requires a personal guarantee, even today. And I was fortunate that one of the investors that I had signed on has quite a bit of property, and so he ended up having to put up a couple apartment complexes and a Tahoe house, and I didn't have any property at the time, so. It probably wouldn't have gotten done. And since he's more, and anybody who's got more than 20%, which he has to do the same personal guarantee. And that's also something that I didn't realize, actually something he didn't realize. And by the time he realized that, it was too late, which was good for me because he's the one who had all the property. And so in addition to the personal guarantee, some of his assets got attached. Now, fortunately, about a year and a half ago, I was able to I refinanced the deal. And got away from the SBA, and when I refinanced it, I was able to there was no property specifically attached, other than I suppose ultimately, since we have a personal guarantee, they can come get it. But I kind of hope they won't take my home if things go south.
We actually did a program on entrepreneurial debt last week. It's not up on our website yet, but it will be shortly. We had SBA rep there as well. Julie, you want to talk a little bit about your process?
Sure. When I started looking the last quarter at the GSB in my second year. At that time, I was a dual degree with the School of Engineering, so I naturally assumed that I would buy a manufacturing company. And shortly after graduation, when I started going to different companies to see if they would sell it to me, it became very clear that I was not going to be able to buy a manufacturing company. But it ended up turning out for the best because somehow through that I ended up buying a for-profit school and just fell in love with the sector and love the students, love the process, love everything. And so now that I'm on my second venture, continued with the same industry.
Now, on your first deal, you partnered with a private equity firm. Were they a source for deals for you at all, or how did you source your deals?
No, I was the sole source. So it was really more about going to trade shows, going to conferences, trying to meet as many people as I could, taking people out to lunch, taking people out for coffee, and it was really more of that personal relationship that had the deal flow coming through me. And actually, my current venture was actually through some of that same networking that I started right after graduate school.
What did you guys find most difficult about the search process? Rich mentioned the needing moral support from wherever it might come. Was that the most difficult part for you? What did you guys find?
Falling in love with the deal, that's kind of that cliche term, is keeping yourself from just convincing yourself it's the right deal. And since I didn't have the search fund backing, for me it was more going to people who I trusted and talking to them about it. And ultimately you know the most about it, so you have to make the decision. But in talking to different people, it was good that I had some people really pick apart my arguments and force me to kind of look at some of the uglier truths. And the deal I ended up doing, the last minute, I showed it to someone who had M&A experience, and he said, you're overpaying. You got to go back and you got to ask for a reduction, and which amounted to about a 10% reduction. And I just didn't want to do it. I wanted this deal. That this was 6 months in, and I wanted it to happen. And but convinced myself I should do it, and so I went to the owner on a Friday and told him, hey, sorry, you got to come down on your price. And that was on a Friday, and I just had the worst weekend. Because I wanted it so bad, but I had to do this. And fortunately came back on the Monday and agreed to it. So for me, the hardest thing was just that commitment to the process, as you mentioned, and not just doing the deal for the sake of getting it done.
Yeah.
To me, the hardest part is during the search process, the ambiguity of not knowing what's going to happen, and very importantly, and is particularly I think difficult for me, being that I did the search on my own, is the times when you are pursuing a deal, you like the company, you think it's the right one, you spend a month negotiating or whatever, you're getting to the point where you're going to sign a letter of intent, and you're already envisioning yourself living there, and you've already scoped out the neighborhood, and all of a sudden the guy calls and says, you know what, I changed my mind. Or simply disappears and doesn't call you. It's kind of like going down these alleys that Rich was talking about, and you're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, the light at the end of the alley, and you find a big cement wall, and you got to go back and start all over again.
That's when you're supposed to take a day off.
That's very tough. That is really very tough.
Yeah. Julie?
I have to agree with Michael. It's just falling in love with the deal, and throughout this whole process, you're the top salesperson. You're selling other people. You're selling yourself. You're selling the seller that this is the one, and it's very hard to separate sort of a rational state of mind and how badly you want this. The turnaround that I bought, I could even tell I was becoming delusional. There was some serious compliance issues and just all these problems, and I would sort of rationalize it. It's not that bad, and I can fix that. And you tend to lose focus because you want it so badly. And that was one of the things that was very difficult for me to really step back and put a list of pros and cons. And was I really able to solve these problems, or was I just fooling myself and think just because I wanted the deal done that I could do it later?
I've got a pretty interesting story. So I haven't done an official search. I've done a number of endeavors over the years, but as I mentioned earlier, we host an annual gathering of our entrepreneurs, and we generally lay out this nice little we think about the agenda, and we'll talk about the search for maybe 2 hours, and then have lunch, and then talk about some challenges in the management side the rest of the day. And the last 2 sessions we've had, we've scheduled less and less time to the search and more to the ongoing management challenges. Forget it. Even the guys that have been out of the search 4 years, all they want to talk about is the search. It's clearly one of the most emotional things that they've ever experienced. And to just kind of have group therapy talking about it is serious value to them. All the other searchers who are in the middle of it are like, oh, God, it's not going to go away, is it? It's a hard deal.
That's true. I remember one search funder, we were at an event one time, and I think one of the hardest parts, at least from my side of the equation, watching my husband go through it, was everybody coming up saying, you found a company yet? When are you going to get a real job? And one of these search funders at the event came up to me and says, I'm going to sit here and talk to you because nobody else understands what I'm doing. That it can be very isolating. One of the things, I remember election day, every time I watched somebody who's won the presidential election, I turned to my husband, I said, boy, he's going, oh, now crap, I got to do the job. I mean, you buy a company, you show up the first day, here are all these people who've been working at this company. I mean, how do you manage that transition into running a company? How do the employees react to frequently a young person coming in to run a company, which probably was not run by a young person before? How's that transition look?
Okay, I'll jump in. So you definitely need to script it. It's something that I thought about a lot in terms of, it's kind of what's my 100-day plan. What I've got to do, and script and orchestrate all your moves down to interviewing, talking to every single person individually on day one, figuring out who you want to pull aside ahead. So there was a couple of key people, salespeople, that I pulled aside the day before I went in there and talked to every other employee. Being younger, I brought in one of my investors who, while he's only 10 years older than me, he looks about 20. And so I kind of brought him in and said, hey, here's one of my investors, and while I won't be here day to day, the guy's got 20 years experience in this industry, and he's going to be around. I tried to keep the strategy talk to a minimum. It was more about, what does this mean to you as employees? I didn't go in there with a vision and try to paint this grand scheme. It was more about allaying fears, uncertainties, and doubts about what this meant to them and why it was going to be a good thing for them. And then you set about dealing with all the pent-up frustrations and stuff that's been boiling in these companies that you didn't know about. And so, you want to make sure that you don't go in, or at least for me, it was important not to go in there and start trying to make radical changes, because I was a really smart guy and was going to revolution, but go in and learn, and kind of I had to absorb a lot of frustrations and different things that were going on, and then kind of like slowly pick my spots, look for quick wins before I started going in there and making wholesale changes. So that was my approach, and it was less about me and my youth and more about, okay, here's the new guy, and let me see what he can do, and here I want to vent my frustrations and try to get something out of this new guy.
It sounds similar to the process I went through, although I was fortunate that in the process when I was negotiating the deal, fairly soon after I signed a letter of intent with the owner, I think in their minds they kind of decided or made the mental determination that they had sold the company. Even while I was doing diligence, and a million things could have happened and the deal wouldn't have gone through, but in their minds they had sold the company. So they actually opened the doors fairly widely open and said, and they started, and people at the company started treating me as the new CEO. Very 6 months before, maybe 4 months before the deal actually closed. So I had a good amount of time to actually get to know people, spend time with them, do a little bit of the reassuring that I'm not going to try to come in here and pretend I'm smarter than everybody and change things around. I was very focused on explaining that first and foremost, I'm coming here to learn, the business and then build a good platform so that we can grow the business going forward. I also brought Rich in. Fortunately, he doesn't look 20 years old. It just, certainly knowing that there's a group of investors behind me added to the credibility. And the credibility thing is one that, I've had to work on for the last year. I don't think, even though you come in as a new CEO and everybody knows you're the president of the company, you have to earn that credibility no matter what. And that's what I've been working on in the past year, and I think it's worked fairly well. Just radical change of philosophy with the prior owners, and done a lot of things in the way of management style that I think the people that are there, who are very good but were never allowed to make any decisions, they actually appreciate the change quite a bit.
Julie, how was your transition?
When I first bought Clarita Career College right after business school, I was fortunate to have the seller hire me to run the school. So I was able to be on site before the transaction closed for about 5 months, and that was just ideal because I could use that time to meet people, show them who I am, what I want to do, and then so when the transaction actually closed, it was a very peaceful, very smooth process. With the turnaround, I actually had the total opposite, where as soon as we closed, I actually had to fire the majority of the administrative staff. So I was not the popular person. And, it was tough. And so there were things that, people didn't like me for a long time, and that's very tough. And, I had to do things like, which I still have to do today, which is, I pay payroll every week. So, payroll 4 times a month versus the 1st and the 15th, which is, that's not fun, but it was something that I had to do to convince them that this is a solid company. I set the pattern very early on, and so it was tough. It was tough.
Rich, do you have any kind of best practices or
Yeah,
lessons learned by hard knocks?
Julie's story, I think, is sort of symptomatic of the whole spectrum. You may have, as you're going through your search or you're envisioning running your company, an ideal script, like Michael mentioned. But the reality is that it's going to take 6 months to close. Sellers have different motivations. There's different circumstances. You have to be really creative. There's this mechanism that Julie talked about on her first deal, where you actually get brought in earlier as a consultant. And sometimes during the due diligence, that's sort of the beard that you kind of hide under, because sellers often don't want employees to know the business is for sale, and so they'll say, yes, we're bringing a consultant in. He's going to help us. They're going to help us look at the business. To the other end of the spectrum, where it's very abrupt and you have to change things. A lot of sellers, you kind of want to have them around for at least 6 months for both their own transitional reasons and because you want to make sure there aren't some huge problems in the due diligence that were missed, and you probably might want to pay them for 6 months, and part of their compensation is tied to sort of the company being as represented. So usually there's also a little choppiness there where people will go around you and go talk to the old owner. You got to make sure you watch that. Another trick that you can sometimes do, we've had it happen successfully a couple times, is to either through your part of the transaction price or through the seller's goodwill have some sort of an employee bonus that goes back to the employees within the first 6 months of the transaction as sort of a please stay and you get paid extra sort of thing, and a thank you from the seller. Any kind of goodies that can go to the employees early, it makes their life tangibly better, makes the transition go a lot smoother.
Now, in theory, you guys are all making these acquisitions and going to add a tremendous amount of value to the company and then sell it and make your millions and retire. What's been your strategy to add value to your companies? You've obviously had a turnaround to deal with, but where have you been trying to add value to the companies, and how are you doing that?
Our primary focus is actually on real estate. So the profits from the school actually fund real estate acquisition. So it's we don't envision a selling point for the school. For example, I plan on being 90 years old and still running these schools. So I don't see an exit strategy, and it's just really about creating the right management team, creating a great morale culture. When you don't have an exit strategy, you're really building for the long term, and so you do make these sacrifices early on that maybe you wouldn't have made if you had like a 5-year or 3-year strategy. So it's just really about loving what I do and just trying to make my employees happy, my students happy, trying to grow, trying to buy more real estate.
That's the beauty of not having investors. You don't have to give them a return.
Yes.
Sorry, Rich.
It's attention.
Moises?
So my strategy during the first year for creating value is not destroying any value first. I've really taken the approach that certainly during the first year, I want to learn the business. And a couple of things that I've learned in the first year is, number one, there's typically some low-hanging fruit that you can come in and identify, and small changes here and there. But firstly, when you come into a company, certainly in my case, you don't know what you don't know. And there's a lot of things that I've come to learn this year that I just didn't have a clue when I first bought the company, even after 6 months of due diligence, even after 9 months of studying the industry. There's just a lot of things a tremendous amount of things that I've learned this year that with the information now and with the knowledge and that will only get better over time, you can certainly make smarter decisions and not waste a lot of time. I think it's dangerous to fool yourself into thinking that you have this MBA and you're going to come in and you're going to make all these great changes and the company's going to be amazing. Well, guess what? The people that were there were probably just as smart, if not smarter, and certainly street savvy. So my strategy has been, first come in and learn the business, figure it out first before making any big changes. The other thing is that I think particularly in a small company, there's just so much change that a small company can take, and particularly the people at a small company can take in a defined period of time. And I think you got to be real careful about managing that, so people that have been used to a certain lifestyle. I mean, I have employees in my company that have been there for 20 years and very little has changed, and all of a sudden you got all these things going on. It's dangerous. You can risk losing a lot of very key people if you try to do too much too quickly.
Michael, how long ago was it you bought your company?
4 years.
4 years? Okay.
Yeah, 4 years. So it started for me, and I guess background-wise, how I ended up in the commercial printing industry is, for 3 years I'd been vice president of marketing for a company that developed e-commerce software for the print industry. So in that role, I literally went into all the industry trade shows, and I visited hundreds of printers. And so by the time I started my search, I had an idea of why, or at least I thought I knew why they didn't do as well as they could do. And again, not knowing what you don't know is always the big surprise. And so my strategy was buy a good company that was solid operationally, but get the value by growing the top line. And so with that allowed me to not grow it up and sell it, but like Julie, my hope is that I'll grow it large enough, throw off enough cash so that I can increasingly add more professional management, and my role becomes less day-to-day as it is today, but I can take off for a month and the company runs itself, and I go on vacation and I come back and I still get to participate in the strategy of the company. So my goal at the end of the day is not to sell it, but to have it generate enough cash to support my lifestyle. And so, as 4 years ago I bought the company, I've grown revenue 50%. That's allowed me to root out some weak players, bring in a sort of a middle management layer of professional management. I'm not there yet. I'm still doing the 12-hour days and every Saturday morning till noon or 1. But I see the path that if I have another year next year like I had in 2006 and the year after that, I'll increasingly be able to get myself to the size where I can start to back out and just do the things I want to do with the company. Because I think I would be bored if I didn't have. I think this is the kind of thing that I don't want to say play with, but this will be my project. And so if I can get to the point where we're generating enough cash where I can always be involved strategically and go in and see the top clients, that would be a great lifestyle for me. And so when I get to the point where it just runs by itself if I don't show up, then I'll consider it a success.
Could I add one thing?
Go ahead, please do.
One of the things we like about the search fund model is that to us it is a great indicator of the persuasiveness and innate salesmanship of an entrepreneur. The notion of a search fund in and of itself is kind of preposterous. I want you to invest in me. I don't know what I'm going to do with the money yet, but believe me, I'll work hard for it. If you can pull that off, convince 12 people to do that, you're a natural salesman. If you can convince a seller that you have the money behind you and the moxie and the ability to sell, to pull off the transaction, you're a good salesperson. If you can convince a bank or some other investors that you're worth the risk, you're a good salesperson. Inevitably, in our mind, where most of the value can be added in small businesses is on the sales and marketing side. It's entirely rational for a very smart guy who's been running a business for 20 years, once he gets to pulling $1 million a year out of the business, and he's 58 years old and he likes his lifestyle, like Michael said, it's not all that great a calculation for him to now reinvest in new products or new sales initiatives or to hire new salespeople, because he's got his life exactly where he wants it. And so, like I mentioned, if you're innately a salesperson and you're running a small business, you're going to end up spending a lot of your time on the sales side, and that you can usually find a way of making a nice jump in your business by concentrating on the sales and marketing side.
First question is, why not start a business? Why is this more attractive than starting a business? We talked about comparing the two models. And then how do you make the economics of a service business start?
For me, it was timing. In 2002, when I decided to search for a company, I thought initially I would start a company. But in 2002, if you guys think back, things were pretty tough out there and valuations had really come down. And I felt I could buy a company and get a sort of a higher return sooner by doing what I did, which is buy a company that's good operationally but lacked the sales and marketing savvy, and that would be more successful than trying to come up with some great new idea and start a company and get investors and employees and everything. So for me, it was timing. I wouldn't have done that even 2 or 3 years earlier, where valuations were crazy, even for small private companies.
I was going to say, certainly during that time frame, we didn't see that many search funds starting in 99, 2000. What about the service business? Rich, do you want to?
To both of those questions, what strikes us is the fact that you've got an ongoing cash flow to leverage, both operationally and financially. If you've got a service business that already has customers and you can do your due diligence and kind of confirm that it's not a commodity, that the switching costs are relatively high, we think that you've kind of mitigated a lot of the risks of giving money and power to a younger entrepreneur that might not be able to handle all of the variety of issues that come with a startup. So the search fund kind of, in our mind, gives you a lot of the upside and a lot less of the downside to a startup. And the service component of it, you really got to check on the due diligence and make sure it's not a straight commodity service. Because if you've got customers and you're providing service for them, they don't want to switch.
I think the question pertains to getting desperate at the end. Is it necessary to have a 2-year runway, or can you get desperate at 6 months?
Well, I'll talk about it from my perspective. I think if you look at the structure, there's definitely a built-in incentive to do a deal, to do something. whether, and frankly, a lot of it is serendipity. When, first of all, how quickly can you get up to speed on the industry that you're convinced you want to be in? But more importantly, within those 2 years, there's a component of luck of when you find, the right company in the right industry with the right guy that is ready to sell at a relatively rational price. Again, talking about it from my experience, looking back at a lot of the deals that I had early on, at the time, they probably looked like really good deals, and I really wanted to do them, but I'm so glad I did not do them. And I think there's certainly that learning curve at the beginning of just looking at a bunch of stuff.
Now, how much runway did you have after you made your acquisition?
Well, I closed my fund in April, and I found, like I said, I found the company fairly quickly, and I bought the company in January, so that was a period of 8 months.
So you still had another year of
quite a bit
funding that could have
runway. Yeah. But part of the reason why I decided to raise a search fund was because I wanted to avoid getting desperate. I mean, I was basically doing a self-funded search, and when you do a self-funded search, you see your bank account going down every month. And I didn't want to be in the situation where I just had to do any deal because of that exact negative incentive. And so I said, let me raise a search fund and give myself the right amount of time.
I have two little added points to that. One of the places where we feel that we can add value as investors in the search that really know the whole search process is that at 18 months, if we really like the entrepreneurs and we feel that their potential is great, and we get a sense they're starting to feel the collar a little bit and getting a little intense and overly anxious, we like to talk to them and say, look, you're doing great work. You're going to find a business, and if you run out of money, it's not going to be that hard to keep looking, and we will fund you. And so that drop dead date kind of recedes a little bit in their review mirror.
The question was, give some substance and some numbers around the range on the size of search funds. And given that there's so much cash in the market right now, is that affecting the ability to make acquisitions?
Great questions. As a rule of thumb, the budget number that searchers are talking about these days is trying to give yourself a 30-month runway, 2.5 years. At a salary of 80 grand a year with attendant due diligence expenses and such, that usually pencils out to between 250 and 300 grand for a single entrepreneur and 550 usually for two guys. Going into the second question, that's a nice segue, is that there's a school of thought in the search fund world about single guys versus two-person teams. The two-person teams are much better at finding deals. Two heads equal three sets of eyes. I mean, they are more prodigious at turning up deals. Single guys, it's harder. There's just not as much bandwidth. On the other side, single guys are more likely to find a deal that's in the sweet spot of the old traditional search fund, which is below the radar. They can work the economics out so that they can see at the end, they can envision making their $5 to $10 million if everything goes right, and they can buy a $5 million business. If you've got two people, they start looking up in the $15 million revenue range, and now all of a sudden, in the last couple of years, they're pushing up against the private equity money, which is surging down. And so it is a problem that particularly with two-person teams that are ambitious and have raised 550 grand, so now their step up, I mean, that's a big number. All of a sudden, if you multiply that times 1.5 and you plug in 800 grand of phantom equity into a deal, you need to hit a pretty big homer to make it sing for both of the two guys. And so we have had issues where, I'm sorry guys, this is a good-looking business, but we cannot bid against some private equity shop that's got 150 million under management, and they're willing to pay 7 times EBITDA. It just isn't going to work. And so that's where we have to show discipline, and we have to signal that to them pretty quickly, because we can't get into auctions with those guys.
Time for one more question.
While at the GSB, I did a 390 and looked at 2 industries actually with Chuck Holloway, which was very helpful in terms of really analyzing a sector or an industry and just going through it systematically. Also during that time, I called investors, tried to set up meetings. Some I was successful with, some not. Spent a lot of time at the CES. Linda, in particular, was just tremendously, enormously helpful. Just really tried to learn as much as I could. Speak with former search funders, because while I was at the GSB, I thought I was going to do a search fund. And what I found that the network of search funders is just wonderful. They always return your calls. They always take the time to speak with you and really provide good contacts, deal flow. And it was something that actually took me by surprise how close-knit that network is. And then graduation just came quickly, and then you're sort of on your own.
Moises, you were out, a year?
I was actually out a year and a half before I started.
So while you were at school, you weren't doing anything in particular?
No, I thought about doing a search fund. In my particular case, I felt like I wanted to get back into the business world a little bit after 2 years of basking in the sun and doing all the great things that you do at business school. Yeah, that's what I hear. I'm glad I'm out. So just again, I kind of thought about the idea, but wanted to get back into the business world. I went back into private equity, and that experience in my case was just very helpful in terms of knowing what to look for in a company, analyzing deals, knowing how to talk to brokers and debt sources, equity investors, etc.
And do you guys have anything to add, last words of wisdom before we dismiss?
I'll just echo what Julie said, because this came up a lot more in the last panel, but the alumni resources are great. I mean, by that I mean the former students. Going through it, everyone took my call. Everyone did lunch with me, and just, it was amazing how much I learned just by talking to so many people. Every meeting, every phone call, I learned at least one thing that I could use, and so use that resource.
One last thing is, if you're thinking about doing something like this, and for some reason you don't think you're quite ready, I really recommend that you talk to us, you talk to other people that are running businesses. One of the biggest bottlenecks that our businesses have is talent. And you can learn an awful lot about whether this really is the right world for you if you go to work for a small business for a year or two. And they'll put you in key roles, give you all kinds of great responsibilities. It's one way of kind of bridging that doubt gap if you haven't.
You have to be willing to move to Bettendorf, Iowa.
Exactly.
I've got a portfolio of deals, of companies from Honolulu to Charlotte, and nobody has asked about Moline.
I had a grid with Doug, and Iowa was one of the ones that was X'd out on our list. So, power to you for going. So, thank you all of you for coming. I hope you enjoy the day.